She hurled the letter into the dirt and pressed both hands over her mouth to keep from screaming because the wagon was never coming. The man was never coming, and the life she had traded everything to reach had never existed at all. 3 hours. She had waited 3 hours on that platform with her one leather bag and her one foolish hope. And now the station master was locking the door behind her, like she was simply one more piece of luggage left behind by someone who no longer wanted her. If you believe that even the most broken beginning can lead somewhere beautiful, subscribe to this channel, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Margaret Whitmore had learned very early in life that crying was a luxury she could not afford. She had cried once when her mother died one long, terrible night when she was 11 years old, and there was nobody left in the house to hear her. After that, she made herself a quiet promise. Tears were for people who had someone to wipe them away. She did not have that. She had only herself, and herself needed to keep moving. So when she understood, standing outside the Willow Creek train station in the breathless heat of a Texas summer afternoon, that Samuel Carter was not coming, she did not let herself cry. Not at first. She stood very still. She read the letter again. Even though she had already read it 40 times on the train, even though she had every word memorized the way a person memorizes scripture. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, a man who chose his words with intention. Or so she had believed. She read the part where he wrote that she would have a home. She read the part where he promised she would be respected. She read the closing line, "I will be waiting at the station myself. You will not have to ask for directions." And she felt something in her chest go very quiet. The kind of quiet that came right before something broke. She folded the letter. She put it back into the front pocket of her leather bag. She sat back down on the wooden bench outside the station door and told herself to think. Thinking was something she was good at. It had saved her before. When her father drank away the farm, she thought her way into a seamstress position in Abilene. When the seamstress shop closed, she thought her way into a bookkeeping job at a general store. When the store owner decided he would rather pay his nephew than a capable woman, she answered an advertisement in the back of a newspaper and thought her way into believing a letter from a stranger in Texas meant something real. So she sat on the bench and she thought, but the heat was crushing, and the dust kept blowing, and every time a wagon rolled past the station road, her eyes went to it, automatically searching, hoping, and every time it was not the right wagon, something inside her sank a little further. An hour passed. Then another. The station master, a thin man with a gray mustache, and the expression of someone permanently disappointed in humanity, came outside twice to look at her. The second time, he stopped. "You waiting on someone, miss?" "Yes," Maggie said. "A Mr. Samuel Carter. He owned a ranch several miles east." He was supposed to. The station master's face did something complicated. It was the kind of face a person made when they knew something they did not want to say. "Carter," he repeated. "Yes." He pulled off his hat and turned it in his hands. "Miss, I don't know how to tell you this without just telling you. Samuel Carter sold his ranch back in the spring, left the territory, got married to a woman down in Houston. Her family had money. From what I heard," he put his hat back on, "I'm sorry. If you got a letter from him promising you something, I'd say he sent that letter before he made other arrangements." Maggie did not move. "Before he made other arrangements," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at the road, "and he simply forgot to inform me." The station master had the decency to look ashamed. "I couldn't say what he was thinking, miss. I only know what I know." He paused. "Is there someone I can wire for you? Someone who could come get you?" There was nobody to wire. That was the part of the story she had never said out loud to anyone, not to the women at the seamstress shop, not to the man at the general store, not to the pastor at the church she attended twice a month because it was the respectable thing to do. There was nobody, no family left, no close friend, nobody who would notice if Margaret Whitmore disappeared from one town and never arrived at another. She had answered Samuel Carter's advertisement precisely because she had nobody. Because she was 31 years old, and she had worked hard every day of her adult life, and she was still one bad season away from having nothing. Because his letter had described a ranch that needed a woman with practical skills, bookkeeping, cooking, management, and he had written it like he was looking for a partner, not a decoration. She had wanted to believe it was real. She had needed to believe it. No, she told the station master. There's nobody to wire. Thank you for telling me. He nodded, unhappy, and went back inside. Maggie sat on the bench. She counted the money in her purse. $3.40. The train ticket had taken most of what she saved. She had been so certain she wouldn't need more, that the ranch would be waiting, that she would arrive and begin immediately, that within a week she would be earning her keep. $3.40. She looked at the town. Willow Creek was small, smaller than she had pictured from Samuel's letters. A main street with a handful of buildings, a saloon at one end, a church at the other, and a scattering of homes in between. Not a place that would have work, simply waiting for a woman who arrived with no references and no connections and no explanation that didn't sound like a cautionary tale. She pressed her hands together in her lap. Do not cry, she told herself. Think. But the heat pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight, and the dust burned the back of her throat, and the bench was hard beneath her. And she had been traveling for 2 days with barely any sleep. And the letter was in her bag with its 38 careful lies. And she had nothing, and for one single, terrible moment, all the thinking in the world could not hold back what was pushing against the back of her eyes. She put her hand over her mouth. She looked at the empty road. And the tears came quietly, the way they always did when she could not stop them, not with any sound. Just with the particular quality of stillness that was worse than sobbing. She had survived poverty. She had survived grief. She had survived being overlooked and underpaid and dismissed by men who thought a woman's competence was something to be suspicious of. She had survived all of it by keeping her head down and her mind sharp and her expectations small. But this being forgotten, being used, being the kind of woman a man sent letters to when he needed a backup plan and then simply discarded when something better came along. This was a different kind of hurt. It went somewhere deeper than hardship. It touched something she had spent 20 years trying to protect. The station master locked the front door behind her. The sound of the key turning in the lock was so loud in the quiet of the evening that she flinched. She was sitting outside a locked building with $3.40, and the sun was going down, and she had nowhere to go. Don't cry alone, miss. The voice came from somewhere to her left, not close. Not intrusive, just present. Low and unhurried, the way a man spoke when he wasn't trying to startle anyone. She turned. He was standing several feet away, near the corner of the station building. Tall, well over 6 feet, with wide shoulders and a posture that said he did physical work every day and had done it for years. His hat was worn at the brim. His boots were dusty. He had the look of a man who had come into town to do something practical and had not expected to find himself in the middle of someone else's difficulty. He was not looking at her with pity, exactly. It was something more measured than that, like a man recognizing a situation he understood without needing it explained. I'm fine, Maggie said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He looked at the empty road for a moment. Then he looked back at her. No, ma'am. You're not, he said it, without any particular judgment, just the plain statement of a man who dealt in facts. But that's all right. Most people aren't fine when they're sitting alone outside a locked building in a town they don't know. He paused. I'm William Dawson. I've got a ranch about 4 miles east. If you need somewhere to be tonight, I've got a spare room, and my housekeeper makes enough supper for 6, even when there's only 2 of us. Maggie stared at him. In her experience, men who offered things to women they didn't know wanted something in return. She had learned that early, and she had never unlearned it. Why, she asked. It came out more bluntly than she intended. She saw something in his shift, not offense, but something that might have been a quiet kind of respect. Because you're in a hard spot, he said, and I've been in hard spots. And nobody helped me, and I thought afterward that the world would be a slightly better place if people helped each other more and asked questions about it less. He looked at her bag. That's the whole of my reasoning, Miss Whitmore, she said. Margaret Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. He touched the brim of his hat. You don't have to come, I'm not going to argue. But the offer stands. She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the locked station door. She looked at the $3.40 she knew were in her purse. Your housekeeper, she said. Is there truly a housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge has worked for me for 11 years, he said. She'll be annoyed if I bring home a guest without notice. But she'll feed you regardless, because she is constitutionally incapable of letting anyone go hungry. I say this as someone who has witnessed her feed 4 unexpected cowhands and a traveling preacher on Thetage evening without once changing her expression. Despite everything, despite the heat and the exhaustion and the $3.40 and the letter in her bag, Maggie felt something loosen, very slightly in her chest. Not trust, but the smallest possible precursor to it. All right, she said. Thank you, Mr. Dawson. He picked up her bag before she could reach for it, not in the way of a man making a point, but in the automatic way of a man whose manners were so habitual they required no thought, and walked toward a wagon, hitched at the far end of the station road. Maggie followed him, and she thought, I do not know this man. I do not know this town. I have $3.40 and a letter from a liar and no plan whatsoever. And then just under that, quiet as breath, but I am still here. I am still standing, and that has always been enough before. The wagon rolled out of Willow Creek in the long orange light of evening, and Margaret Whitmore pressed her hands flat on her knees and looked straight ahead, and did not let herself look back. The ranch came into view slowly, the way things did at dusk, first as a shape, then as several shapes, then as a structure that was clearly well built and equally clearly in need of attention. The main fence along the east pasture had a section leaning. The barn doors hung slightly crooked. A water trough near the gate had developed a crack someone had patched with river clay, and the patch was holding, but only just. Maggie noticed all of it without meaning to. It was an old habit she had spent too many years keeping accounts not to see where something was bleeding money. It's not much to look at right now, William said. Not apologetically, just honestly. It's honest, Maggie said. He glanced at her sideways. Something in his expression said that wasn't the answer he had expected. Mrs. Aldridge was as advertised, annoyed. She appeared in the doorway before the wagon had fully stopped, a compact woman of perhaps 60, with sharp eyes and flour on her apron, and the expression of someone who had just discovered a problem she had not budgeted time for. William Dawson, she said. Mrs. Aldridge, he said pleasantly. We have a guest, I can see that. Miss Margaret Whitmore. She's come a long way, and she needs supper. And the spare room, Mrs. Aldridge's eyes moved to Maggie, quick, thorough. The assessment of a woman who had made snap judgments about people for 6 decades, and was rarely wrong. Maggie met her gaze directly and did not look away. Whatever Mrs. Aldridge was looking for, she apparently found enough of it. Supper will be 20 minutes, she said. The spare room needs fresh sheets. She pointed at Maggie. Come inside out of that heat. It was not warmth exactly, but it was something. The kitchen was the best room in the house. Maggie could see that immediately. Everything in it was purposeful and well organized. Arranged by a woman who had thought hard about efficiency. Copper pots hung in order of size. Herbs dried above the window. The table was worn smooth from years of use. Maggie sat where she was pointed. A cup of cold water appeared in front of her. She drank it in 3 long swallows and immediately felt more like herself. Where are you from? Mrs. Aldridge asked, her back turned, her hands moving at the stove. Abilene most recently, Maggie said. Before that, a farm outside of Comfort. You came in on the evening train. Yes. Somebody supposed to meet you? There was a pause. Yes, Mrs. Aldridge did not push. She stirred whatever was in the pot and said nothing. And Maggie understood that this was a woman who asked questions for practical reasons, not for gossip. The answer told her what she needed to know, that Maggie's situation had not gone as planned, and she filed it away without comment. William appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had taken off his hat and his coat, and, without them, he looked slightly less like the frontier stranger who had appeared at the station, and slightly more like a man in his own home, more tired. Maybe more human. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "there's one thing I should say before we get settled." Maggie waited. "You're welcome to stay here, as long as you need to get yourself sorted. No conditions on that. But I want to be straight with you about what this place is and what it isn't. Because I think you deserve a straight accounting." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "This ranch has been struggling. I've got 12 head of cattle and I'm supposed to have 25. I've got 2 ranch hands and I should have 4. My accounts are a mess because I'm better with cattle than with ledgers. And something in the books has been wrong for over a year, and I can't find where." He put his hands flat on the table. "I'm not telling you this because I expect anything from you. I'm telling you because I think you're a practical woman, and practical women don't like to be surprised." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. "How long have the books been wrong?" she asked. He blinked. Of all the responses he had apparently anticipated, that was not one of them. "About 14 months. Do you have them here?" "The ledgers? They're in the study. May I see them after supper?" There was a silence. From the stove, Mrs. Aldridge made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "You can see them tonight if you want," William said slowly. "But you've just come off a hard day, Miss Whitmore. There's no rush. The longer a bleeding account goes unwatched, the more it bleeds," Maggie said. Then she caught herself. "I'm sorry. That was forward of me. I don't know why." "No," he said. And something in his voice was different now, not surprised anymore, but quiet with a kind of recognition. "No, you're right. That's exactly right." He looked at her across the table. "Have you done bookkeeping before?" "For 7 years at Halverson's General Store in Abilene," she said. "Before that, I kept the accounts for my father's farm from the time I was 14, which was not a financially rewarding experience, but was a very educational one." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close. "Eat first," Mrs. Aldridge said firmly, without turning around. Books after they ate. The food was simple and very good: beef stew with biscuits, and dried apple pie that had no business being as good as it was given that it was produced on 20 minutes' notice. Maggie ate more than she had intended because her body suddenly remembered that she had barely eaten in 2 days. William ate steadily and quietly. Mrs. Aldridge stood at the counter and ate her portion in efficient bites, watching both of them with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had spent years observing people and had learned to keep her conclusions to herself. Nobody talked much, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people who were each thinking hard about something and had the good sense not to pretend otherwise. After supper, William brought out the ledgers. There were 3 of them, thick, cloth-bound, their spines worn soft with handling. He laid them on the kitchen table with the expression of a man presenting evidence of a crime he was not certain he committed. Maggie pulled the first one toward her. She opened it to the first page. She read for several minutes without speaking. William stood beside the table with his arms crossed and watched her face with the focused, slightly anxious attention of a man watching a doctor examine something that had been worrying him for a long time. Mrs. Aldridge cleared the supper dishes and pretended not to be listening. "Here," Maggie said. She placed her finger on an entry from March of the previous year. "Your feed supplier changed their billing cycle, and your record-keeping didn't change with it. You've been entering one payment as 2 separate entries each month since then. You think you've been paying more than you have, so you've been under-ordering feed to compensate, which means your cattle haven't been getting full rations for over a year, which is why your herd isn't growing the way it should." She turned a page. "And here your ranch hand wages. One of your hands is being paid twice. Different entries, same initials, same amount. Either someone made a consistent clerical error or someone has been skimming." The room was very quiet. "Skimming," William said. His voice had gone flat. "You're saying someone has been. I'm saying it's possible. I'm not saying it's certain. I'd need to check the employment records against the pay entries to know for sure. She looked up at him. This isn't something that happened overnight. If I'm reading this correctly, it's been going on since last spring. He put both hands on the table and stared at the page she was indicating. Mrs. Aldridge had stopped pretending to be busy. Pete Holloway, William said quietly. He started in April. He came with a reference from the Garner operation over in Bexar County. Can you verify the reference? I took it at face value. Maggie kept her expression neutral. She had seen this before, not on ranches but in stores. In small businesses, in any operation, where one person handled the money and another person trusted them without checking. It was not stupidity. It was the particular vulnerability of honest people who could not imagine that someone would take advantage of a simple, offered trust. I'm sorry, she said. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. No, he said. He straightened up. His jaw was tight, but his eyes were clear. No, it's what I needed to hear. There's a difference. He looked at her. I brought you in to have a roof over your head, Miss Whitmore. I didn't bring you in expecting you to fix my problems. I noticed the problems, she said. It would feel dishonest not to say. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, I don't know how to thank you for that. You gave me supper and a safe place to sleep, she said. That's enough thanks in the other direction to cover it, Mrs. Aldridge made the sound again, the one that was not quite a laugh. This time it was slightly more in that direction. They went through the ledgers for another 2 hours. By the time they finished, Maggie had identified 4 separate accounting errors and flagged 2 entries that needed verification against employment records. William wrote everything down in a new notebook, careful, precise notes, the handwriting of a man who was very thorough about things he considered important. When she closed the last ledger, she was exhausted in a way that was almost comfortable, the particular exhaustion of a brain that had been used hard. Not the hollow, defeated exhaustion of sitting on a train station bench with nowhere to go. Miss Whitmore, William said. He had been quiet for several minutes. Looking at his notes. Yes? I want to offer you something formal. He chose his words deliberately. I need someone to manage the accounts on this ranch. Properly, with oversight, with real record keeping. I can offer room, board, and a wage, a fair one, not a charity wage. A real working wage for real work. He met her eyes. This is not because I feel sorry for you. I've never in my life hired anyone out of pity, and I don't intend to start. This is because in 2 hours, you identified problems it would have taken me another 2 years to find. If I found them at all, he paused. But I want to be clear. If you take this position, it's a real position. You answer to nobody's judgment about what a woman should or shouldn't be doing. You make decisions in your area of responsibility, and you make them without having to ask my permission for every single one. Maggie sat very still. She was aware that this was the moment. Not the letter had been a fiction. A thing that had never really existed, this was real. This man, this table, this set of worn ledgers, and a legitimate problem that needed her specific skill. I have one condition, she said. He waited. If I find evidence that one of your hands has been stealing from you, I want to be present when you address it. I don't want to be sent to the kitchen while the men have the important conversation. Something moved in William Dawson's expression, something that might have been recognition, the way a person looked when they heard something that described exactly what they thought but had never quite put into words was. Done. Yes, Maggie said. I accept, Mrs. Aldridge, who had been washing the same cup for the past 10 minutes, sat down and went to bed without a word. But as she passed the doorway, Maggie saw the expression on her face, and it looked, for the first time all evening, like something close to satisfaction. The first morning was strange. Not bad strange. The particular strangeness of waking up in an unfamiliar room in an unfamiliar place and needing a full 15 seconds to remember how she had gotten there. The spare room was small and clean. Mrs. Aldridge had made it plain that her standards were absolute, with a single window that caught the early light and a bed that was narrow but had a real mattress. Maggie lay still for a moment and listened. The sounds of a working ranch in the early morning were different from the sounds of a town. Not quite exactly. There were birds and the distant low conversation of cattle, and somewhere the knock of a hammer, but differently textured. More purposeful. She got up. She dressed. She pinned her hair. She took out the small notebook she carried everywhere and wrote down, from memory, every entry she had flagged in the ledgers the night before. Then she wrote a list of things she needed to verify, in order of importance. Then she wrote a list of things she needed access to the supply records, the employment contracts, if there were any, the receipts from the feed supplier going back 18 months. By the time she was done, the smell of coffee had found its way under her door. She went to the kitchen. William was already at the table with a mug and an expression that said he had been up for hours. Mrs. Aldridge handed Maggie a cup of coffee without being asked, which she understood to be a significant something. "I was thinking," William said, "that I'd introduce you to the ranch hands this morning. Let them know your role." Maggie sat down. "How many do you have right now?" "3. Tom and Jesse have been with me for 3 years each. Pete Holloway started last spring." Pete Holloway. The name from the ledger. "How does Pete behave?" she asked. "Generally." William wrapped both hands around his mug. "He's a hard worker, shows up on time, never gives me trouble." A pause. "He asks a lot of questions about the accounts. I thought he was just interested in how the ranch ran." "He asked about the accounts specifically?" "About ordering. About what we were spending on feed. About when I usually did the books." Maggie looked at her coffee. "He was checking," she said carefully. "Not curious. Checking." William said nothing for a moment. Then, "You can't know that for certain yet." "No," she agreed. "I can't. But I want you to know I'm thinking it, so you're not surprised when I find the receipts." He looked at her across the table. "You're a very direct person, Miss Whitmore. I've found that directness saves time," she said. "And time is money, and I suspect this ranch has been losing enough of both. This time." The corner of his mouth moved further than the night before. Still not quite a smile. But she was beginning to understand that this was simply how his face worked, that it moved toward expression slowly. The way a man moved toward a thing he was not certain of. Testing the ground before committing his weight. "I'll take you out to meet the hands after breakfast," he said. She nodded, and Miss Whitmore, he stopped. "Yes? Last night, when I said you'd answer to nobody's judgment." He looked at his mug. "I meant that. Some of the men in this town have opinions about what women should be doing. I can't control what they think, but I can control what happens on this ranch. And on this ranch, the person who manages the accounts is the person who manages the accounts, regardless of anything else." Maggie held the warmth of the coffee mug between her palms and looked at the man across the table. She had known men like Samuel Carter, men whose words were careful and reassuring and hollow all the way through. She was not foolish enough to believe that one breakfast and one evening of honest ledger work was proof of character. But she was watching, and what she was watching so far was consistent. After breakfast, she met the ranch hands. Tom was compact and gray-haired, with the weathered quiet of a man who had worked outdoors for 30 years and had made his peace with everything the weather could do. He shook her hand with matter-of-fact respect, not the exaggerated deference some men gave women they didn't know what to do with, and not the dismissive non-attention of men who had already decided she was irrelevant. Just a handshake. "You exist, I exist. We'll be working near each other. Fine." Jesse was younger, mid-20s. Broad and cheerful, with the easy openness of someone who had not yet had enough hard experiences to make him guarded. He tipped his hat to her twice, which she suspected was one tip more than was standard, and said it was nice to have someone who understood numbers around, because the boss got very tired every time someone tried to explain anything numerical to him. "No offense to the boss, none taken," William said, with the equanimity of a man accustomed to Jesse. Pete Holloway was last. He was medium height and unremarkable, in almost every way the kind of man whose face you would struggle to describe an hour after meeting him. His handshake was firm and his expression was pleasant, and his eyes, when they went to Maggie, did a brief, rapid thing that was not quite an assessment and not quite a calculation. "Nice to meet you, ma'am," he said. You'll be helping with the books? Managing the accounts, William said. Lightly, without emphasis. Just the plain correction. Right, Pete said. The pleasant expression didn't shift. Not even slightly, which was, Maggie thought, itself a kind of information. A man, genuinely indifferent to the distinction, would have looked mildly embarrassed at the correction. Or nodded without thinking about it. A man who was paying careful attention would have gone very still for a fraction of a second, and then recovered. Pete recovered very well. Welcome to the ranch, he said. Thank you, Maggie said. She watched him walk back toward the barn. She did not say anything to William until Pete was well out of earshot. Then she said, very quietly, I'd like to see the supply receipts from April through August of last year. William looked at her. He had seen it too. She could tell by the way he was looking at her, not surprised. But something more complex. The look of a man who had just had a suspicion confirmed by someone else naming it. I'll get them this afternoon, he said. Thank you. The morning passed in work. Real work, the physical, detailed, satisfying work of understanding how a place functioned. Maggie went through supply records with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had done this for years. Building a map of every transaction, cross-referencing dates and amounts and initials, until a pattern emerged from the data, the way a shape emerged from fog as you walked toward it. By midday she had found it. Not speculation, not implication. Actual, traceable, documented evidence. Pete Holloway had been altering supply receipts. Small amounts, never large enough to trigger obvious alarm, but consistent, methodical. He changed the amount paid on incoming invoices, pocketed the difference, and entered the inflated amount in the ledger. It was the kind of theft that required patience and a reasonable understanding of accounting, not sophisticated, but careful. It had been going on for 8 months. When she laid it out for William that afternoon, every piece of evidence, in order, with the original receipts and the ledger entries side by side, he sat at the table for a long time without speaking. His hands were flat on the table. His face was absolutely still. How much, he finally said. Across 8 months. Somewhere between $80 and $90. She paused. That may not sound like. It sounds like exactly what it is, he said. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Not rage. Something quieter, and in some ways, worse, the particular hurt of a man who had extended trust to someone who had used it as an instrument of theft. It sounds like a man I gave work to, and housed, and paid fair wages. Deciding that wasn't enough, Maggie did not say anything. There was nothing useful to say. She had learned a long time ago that the moment when someone understood they had been betrayed was not a moment for words. He sat with it for a while. Then he straightened up. Something in his face settled into resolution. I want you at the table when I talk to him. You said that would be my condition, she said. Not yours, I mean it as mine too, he met her eyes. You found it. You documented it. You deserve to be there. They brought Pete Holloway in that evening. They sat him at the kitchen table, William at the head. Maggie to one side, the stack of evidence between them, like a verdict already rendered. Pete looked at the receipts. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Maggie. For a fraction of a second, his face showed something raw and calculating, not guilt. Not shame, but the rapid assessment of a man deciding which angle had the best odds. I can explain, he started. I'm sure you can, William said. I'm more interested in whether the explanation is true. Pete's eyes went back to the receipts. He picked up the one from April, turned it over, studying it, as if he was looking for an error in Maggie's analysis. These numbers, he started, are correct, Maggie said. The original receipt from Henderson's Supply is there on your left. The entry in the ledger is there on your right. The amounts differ by $6.50. That same difference appears in 17 separate entries across 8 months. Pete set the receipt down. The calculating look in his eyes shifted into something else. Something that was almost relief, the particular relief of a man who has been running for a long time and has finally been caught and no longer has to keep running. I needed the money, he said. Most people who steal need the money, William said. That doesn't make it your money. Pete looked at the table. What happens now, he asked. You leave tonight, William said. You take what's yours and nothing of mine. I won't go to the sheriff if you don't make a reason for me to. I've got no appetite for the court process, and I expect you know that. But you're done here, and if I hear you've done this somewhere else, I'll reconsider that decision." Pete nodded once. He stood. He looked at Maggie one more time, not with hostility. Not exactly. With something that was perhaps recognition of the particular irony that a woman who had arrived at William Dawson's ranch with nowhere to go had been the one to find him. He left. The kitchen was very quiet. Mrs. Aldridge, who had made herself scarce during the conversation, appeared in the doorway with a pot of coffee, as if she had been waiting for exactly the right moment. Which she probably had. She set it on the table. She looked at both of them. She went back to the kitchen. William poured 2 cups of coffee. He slid one across to Maggie. "First day," he said. "First day," she agreed. He looked at the stack of receipts. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the woman across the table from him, the woman who had arrived on his wagon 24 hours ago, with a leather bag and $3.40, and a specific, deliberate way of pressing her hands flat on her knees when she was holding something difficult together from the inside. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She looked up. "I don't know why Carter didn't come for you at that station," he said. "But I think whatever his reasons were, they were his failing. Not yours." Maggie looked at her coffee for a moment. Then she said, "I know that." And the strange thing was, sitting at this table, in this kitchen, on this first day, that had been unlike anything she planned, she actually did. Not fully. Not without the bruise still present beneath it. But enough. She knew it enough to mean it. Outside, the evening had turned the Texas sky, that deep bruised orange that happened only at the end of hot days. And somewhere in the south pasture, William's cattle were making the low, settled sound of animals ending their day, and Margaret Whitmore sat at a stranger's kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was exactly the right temperature, and she was still here. Still standing, and that, she thought, had always been enough before. Pete Holloway was gone before full dark. Maggie heard the sound of a horse leaving, not in a hurry. Not the gallop of a man running, but the steady, deliberate walk of someone who understood that running would only confirm what everyone already knew. She was still at the kitchen table when the sound faded, and she sat there a moment longer after it disappeared. Her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, listening to the silence settle back into the house like something reclaiming its place. Mrs. Aldridge washed the supper dishes without comment. The clink of pot against pot, the pour of water, the soft drag of a cloth, all of it ordinary. All of it unchanged, as if a man had not just been removed from the ranch for theft in that very room 20 minutes ago. There was a specific kind of steadiness in that. Maggie recognized it because she had practiced it herself for years, the deliberate, visible continuation of normal life as an act of will. William came back inside from the barn about an hour later. He had gone out after Pete left, and she had not asked why. Because she understood why some men needed physical space to think. And the barn was his. He sat down across from her without pouring himself more coffee. Just folded his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. "Tom and Jesse took it hard," he said. "They knew Pete. Worked alongside him every day. That's the part that doesn't show up in the ledger," Maggie said. He looked up at her. "The cost to the people who trusted him," she said. "That part you can't document." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "No, you can't," he exhaled. "I'll need to hire someone to replace him. Which means I need to review what we can actually afford to pay. Which means I need to know where the accounts really stand after accounting for everything you found. I can have a corrected summary ready by tomorrow afternoon," she said. "You don't have to. I want to," she said simply. And she meant it. The work was not a burden. The work was the thing that made her feel solid, that located her in this unfamiliar place, and gave her a reason to be in it that had nothing to do with pity or charity or the kindness of a man who happened to be standing near a train station at the right moment. William looked at her for a beat longer than necessary. "All right," he said. "Tomorrow afternoon." She went to bed that night and slept better than she had in months. The next morning she woke before dawn, dressed in the gray half-light, and went to the study. It was a small room off the main hall, more of a large closet. Really, with a desk and a set of shelves, and the kind of organized chaos that happened when a man who was thorough about some things and completely hopeless about others tried to maintain a filing system. Papers were sorted by date in some places and by topic in others, and not sorted at all in a third pile that had clearly become the default destination for anything William didn't immediately know where to put. She started there, with the pile. She worked steadily through the early morning, and by the time Mrs. Aldridge appeared with coffee at 6:15, Maggie had rebuilt the filing system from the floor up and had a clear picture of where the ranch's finances actually stood. It was not as bad as it could have been. It was not good either, but it was knowable, and knowable was the beginning of fixable. And fixable was the beginning of everything. She explained the corrected numbers to William over breakfast, with the new summary laid out flat on the table between them. He listened with the careful, serious attention of a man who understood that he was hearing something important and was determined not to miss it because of pride or impatience. "So we're not bankrupt," he said. "Not bankrupt," she confirmed. "But you've been operating on a thinner margin than you knew. And you've been underinvesting in the herd because of the falsified feed costs. If you can afford to hire one replacement hand and increase the feed order to correct levels, the herd should recover by spring and the income should stabilize by summer." He studied the paper. He did the calculation in his head. She could see him doing it. See the place where his brow tightened and then released as the numbers came out where he needed them to. "I can manage one hand and the feed order," he said. "It'll be tight through winter." "Tight and manageable," she said. "Which is different from tight and failing." He almost smiled. "You're good at that." "At what?" "At finding the distinction that matters." It was a simple thing to say. A practical observation. But something in the way he said it direct, without any intention behind it other than the truth, landed differently than she expected. And she looked back down at the paper a moment, sooner than was necessary. Tom came in for his own coffee shortly after, and the conversation shifted to the practical which pasture needed fence work, whether the south trough would hold through the summer, the disposition of a particular cow who had been agitated for 3 days, and whom Tom described with the resigned affection of a man who had long since accepted that this specific animal was simply going to be difficult on principle. Maggie listened and said nothing for most of it. But when Tom mentioned that the fence supplies they'd ordered in June hadn't arrived yet, and he was starting to worry they'd been shorted, she asked which supplier. Tom glanced at her, then at William. "Garner Brothers over in Waco," he said. Maggie turned to William. "Is that the same account that showed an early payment in July? The one entered twice?" William straightened. "Yes. Then you may have already paid for supplies that were never delivered," she said. "Which means either there was an administrative error on their end, or," she stopped, "or Pete arranged for them not to be delivered," William said flatly. The kitchen went quiet. Tom set his coffee down. He was not a man who showed a lot on his face, but something moved across it now, the slow, specific anger of someone realizing that the scope of the betrayal was larger than he'd understood. "He ordered things we never got," he said, "and pocketed the payment." "Possibly," Maggie said. "I need to write to Garner Brothers and request a copy of their delivery records before we know for certain. But yes, possibly." Tom stood up and went out to the barn without finishing his coffee. He didn't slam the door. That was almost worse. Jesse, when he heard about it at midday, had a different reaction. He went very still, in a way that didn't fit his usual easy energy. And then he said quietly, "He ate supper with us every night. 3 times a week for 8 months. He paused. I let him borrow my good saddle blanket once. Nobody had an answer for that." Maggie wrote the letter to Garner Brothers that afternoon. William read it before she sealed it and said only, "That's exactly right," which was high praise from a man who used words the way he used everything else, with economy and without decoration. The days that followed had a rhythm to them that Maggie hadn't expected to find so quickly. She was up before dawn, in the study by first light, and by the time the ranch came fully awake around her, She had already done 2 or 3 hours of work that would have taken William most of a day. Not because she was faster than him, though she was, at this, but because she had spent years doing precisely this kind of work, and her hands knew the motions the way a musician's hands knew a piece of music they had practiced so many times it lived in the body rather than the mind. William, for his part, worked from before sunup to after sundown with the steady, unhurried endurance of a man who had long since made peace with the fact that ranching was not a life that offered rest. He repaired fences. He managed the cattle. He drove into town for supplies twice a week. He did all of it without complaint and without the particular kind of performative exhaustion that some men used to communicate how hard they were working. He simply worked, and Maggie watched him work the way she had watched everything in her life carefully, without drawing conclusions faster than the evidence warranted, and what she saw was consistent. A man who meant what he said. A man who treated Tom and Jessie with the same direct respect he had offered her. A man who fed a stray dog that had appeared at the barn in the second week of her stay, without acknowledging that he'd done it or asking anyone not to mention it. She mentioned it to Mrs. Aldridge. Mrs. Aldridge said, "He's been feeding that dog for 3 years. He acts like it's a secret. I don't know who he thinks he's hiding it from." She paused. "He does the same with the Henley family on the East Road. Widow woman and 4 children. Every winter he drops off feed and firewood and acts like he happened to be going that direction anyway." Another pause. "He's not a man who likes to be caught being kind." Maggie thought about that for a while. She thought about it while she worked through the accounts. She thought about it while she ate supper, which they had taken to eating together most nights, not formally, not with any acknowledgement that it had become a pattern, just practically because they were both in the kitchen at the end of the day, and Mrs. Aldridge made food for the table rather than for individuals, and it would have been wasteful not to sit together. The conversations at those suppers were mostly practical in the beginning. The accounts, the herd, the fence repair schedule, what the response from Garner Brothers might say when it came. Whether the new hand William was considering a man named Elliot who had worked 3 ranches in the county and came with references William actually intended to verify this time was likely to work out. Sometime in the second week, without either of them deciding it, the conversation started to go elsewhere. It happened gradually. A question about where she had grown up. A piece of information he offered in return, almost reflexively, as if matching what she'd given. The way conversations sometimes built themselves without any intention from the people having them. She learned that he had come to Texas from Tennessee 12 years ago. That the ranch had been his wife's idea, Clara, who had seen an advertisement for land and said the word land the way some women said the word home, and he had understood that she meant something serious by it. That they had 2 good years before Clara got sick. And then a 3rd year that was very hard, and then she was gone. And then 6 months later their infant son went with her from the same fever. He told her this without asking for sympathy, in the same even tone he used to describe fence posts and herd management. But his hands, which were usually still when he talked, moved slightly while he said it, one thumb tracing the edge of the table in a small, unconscious circle, and Maggie understood that the even tone cost him something. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 9 years ago," he said. "That doesn't make it less," she said. He looked at her. And for a moment, just a moment, the careful, measured expression he wore like practical clothing loosened slightly. And what was underneath it was something old and tired and still. "After 9 years, not entirely healed." "No," he said. "It doesn't." She told him in return about her family. Her mother, who had been the practical one. Her father, who had been kind and completely unable to manage money or resist whiskey, and who had meant well every single day of his life without those good intentions ever quite translating into the survival of the farm or the security of his children. Her 2 younger brothers, both gone west before she was 21 to California, one to Oregon, and the way distance had turned them into people she knew better from letters than from memory. "You've been alone a long time," William said, not pityingly. As an observation. I've been independent a long time, she corrected. He considered that. Is there a difference? Yes, she said. Independence is something you build. Alone is something that happens to you. She looked at her hands. I built mine deliberately. That's different from having solitude imposed. He was quiet for a moment. That's a fine distinction. I told you. I'm good at the distinctions that matter. And this time, the corner of his mouth moved all the way. It was, she thought, a very good smile. Unhurried, genuine. The smile of a man who did not deploy it lightly. She looked back at her supper. The response from Garner Brothers arrived at the end of the second week, and it confirmed what Maggie had suspected. 5 separate supply orders had been marked as paid in William's ledger, using cash payments that Pete Holloway had apparently made on behalf of the ranch, but according to Garner Brothers records, only 2 of those orders had ever been placed. The other 3 existed only in the falsified ledger entries. Pete had invented purchases, pocketed the cash, and trusted that William would never look closely enough to notice. Nearly $30, in addition to the wage doubling. In addition to the altered receipt amounts. William read the letter at the kitchen table. His face did not change while he read it. He folded it when he was done. He set it flat on the table. Then he said, "That's enough to go to the sheriff." "Yes," Maggie said. "He told me not to. He told you what he thought would protect him," she said carefully. "That's not the same thing as the truth of the situation." William was quiet. She could see him working through it, the calculation that was not really a calculation at all, but the weighing of competing things that didn't fit neatly on either side of a scale. Justice on one side, the ugliness of a legal process on the other. The fact that Pete was probably already gone from the territory, making recovery of the money unlikely regardless. The fact that the ranch could survive without it, now that it was properly managed. "If I go to the sheriff," he said finally, "and Pete is still somewhere in the county, then there's a trial. And a trial means weeks of my time away from the ranch, and witnesses, and the whole county knowing what happened here." "Yes," Maggie said. "And the $30 probably won't be recovered regardless." "Probably not. So the practical calculation says to let it go." "The practical calculation does say that," she agreed. "But I think you're not making a practical calculation." He looked at her. "I think you're deciding what kind of man you are," she said. "And that's a different kind of arithmetic." He looked at the letter for another long moment. Then he stood, picked it up, and said, "I'm going to ride into town." She nodded. He went. He was gone for 4 hours. When he came back, he said simply, "The sheriff has it now." And that was the end of that conversation. Jesse found them at supper and asked what had happened. And William told him, and Jesse nodded slowly and said, "Good." And Tom, who was sitting at the end of the table, said nothing, but the set of his shoulders changed, some tension releasing that had been there since the night Pete left. The atmosphere of the ranch shifted after that. Not dramatically, it was not the kind of place that did anything dramatically. But the particular tightness that had been present since Pete's departure eased. Like a rope that had been wound one turn too many, finally finding its correct tension. Maggie noticed it first in Tom, who started leaving his coffee mug at the kitchen table in the morning, instead of taking it with him to the barn, a small thing, but it meant he was comfortable enough to count on coming back. She noticed it in Jesse, who started making jokes at supper again. The easy, slightly terrible jokes of a young man testing the temperature of a room. She noticed it in William, who began trusting her judgment on purchasing decisions without reviewing every line himself first. That last change was the most significant. It happened on a Tuesday. She brought him a proposed supply order for the coming month, and he said, "Looks right," without sitting down to check it. And she said, "You should still verify the numbers yourself." And he said, "Miss Whitmore, if your numbers were wrong, you'd be the first person to tell me," and went back outside. She stood in the study for a moment, with the supply order in her hands. She had worked for 7 years for a man who checked every entry she made twice, and still called someone else to confirm her calculations. She filed the supply order. Elliot arrived at the end of the 3rd week, medium height, 40-something, quiet in the specific way of men who had worked alone or in small groups for most of their lives. His references were verified. His first week of work was quiet and steady and without incident. He did not ask questions about the accounts. With 4 people working the ranch, Tom, Jessie, Elliot, and herself, the pace of improvement accelerated. The fence sections got repaired. The cattle started gaining condition as the feed orders corrected. Maggie found 2 more minor discrepancies in the older records, not theft this time. Just the accumulated error of a man doing his own books without the right training, and corrected them, bringing the accounts into the kind of clean alignment that let you see the actual picture instead of a distorted version of it. The actual picture was not bad. Given where they had been 2 months ago, it was genuinely encouraging. She put together a projection for the coming year, cautious, with conservative estimates for cattle prices and a buffer built in for unexpected costs, and showed it to William on a Sunday evening, when neither of them had any particular reason to be working, but were both in the study anyway. He read it slowly. He looked at the numbers. He looked at the projection line that showed the ranch moving from marginal to stable by the following spring. "You built this from scratch," he said. "I built it from your operation," she said. "It was already here. It visible." He set the paper down and looked at her with the expression she had begun to recognize, the one that meant he was thinking something he wasn't sure he was going to say. She had come to understand that he always eventually said it. He just needed to make sure of it first. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to tell me if it's forward. All right. Are you happy here?" She looked at him. The question was simple. It shouldn't have been complicated. And yet it required a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer surprised her, and she wanted to be sure of it before she said it. "Yes," she said. "I think I am. You're not just staying because it's practical." "Mr. Dawson," she said, "I have never done anything merely because it was practical. Practical things have to be worth doing. They have to be good. Not just convenient." She met his eyes. "This is good." He looked at her for a moment in the way he had, steady, unhurried, testing the ground before committing his weight. Then he said "good," and went back to looking at the projections. And that was all. But that night, after the house was quiet, Maggie sat by the window of the spare room, which had stopped being the spare room in her mind somewhere around the end of the first week, and had simply become her room, and thought about that question. "Are you happy here?" She had not been asked that question in years. She had been asked whether she was capable, whether she was available, whether she was reliable, whether she could start Monday. She had not been asked whether she was happy. The fact that he had thought to ask it meant something. She wasn't certain yet what it meant. She was careful about certainty. Certainty had walked her onto a train and across hundreds of miles toward a man who didn't come to the station. She had paid a significant price for certainty before it was warranted. But she was watching, and what she was watching was a man who asked whether she was happy. A man who had told her she answered to no one's judgment on this ranch. A man who fed a stray dog for 3 years and called it a coincidence. A man who rode into town for 4 hours and came back having done the right thing, even when it cost him time and dignity and the certainty of anyone knowing why. She was watching, and the evidence was accumulating. And then in the 4th week, on a Wednesday afternoon when the supply wagon had just come back from town and she was helping Jessie unload the dry goods order, Samuel Carter came back to Willow Creek. She didn't know he was back until Mrs. Aldridge appeared in the doorway of the barn with the specific expression she used when she had information she would have preferred not to carry. "Someone asking about you in town," she said. Maggie set down the sack of flour she was holding. "About me. A man named Carter. He's been telling people he knows you, Mrs." Aldridge paused, "Saying you came here chasing him. That you misunderstood the nature of his letters. That you're a woman who forms attachments that aren't warranted and follows men across state lines when she ought to know better." The barn was very quiet. Jessie had gone still beside her. He was staring at Mrs. Aldridge with the focused attention of a young man deciding whether he was angry. Maggie stood without moving and felt the old cold settle into her chest, not despair. Not the helpless kind of hurt she had felt on the train station bench. Something else. Something that had a harder edge. Because she knew what Samuel Carter was doing. She had spent 4 weeks learning to read a set of books well enough to find patterns in them. And Samuel Carter's pattern was not complicated. He had come back because he had heard she was still in the territory. He had heard she was working at Dawson Ranch. And a woman with a job and a reputation to protect was more dangerous to him than a woman sitting alone on a train station bench. He was trying to ruin her standing before she could think clearly about what she knew about him. "Where is he?" she said. "Miss Whitmore." Mrs. Aldridge started. "Where is he right now?" Mrs. Aldridge looked at her. Then, with the expression of a woman who had made a rapid judgment and come down on a particular side, "Dunmore's General Store. He was there 20 minutes ago when I came past." Maggie untied her apron. "Miss Whitmore," Jesse said. His voice had an edge. "You want me to—" "No," she said. "I don't." She walked out of the barn, and she walked the 4 miles to town, and she did not hurry, and she did not rehearse what she was going to say. Because she had known what she was going to say since Mrs. Aldridge said the word misunderstood, and it required no rehearsal. She was still going to say every word of it. The dust of the road settled around her feet as she walked. And the sun was still high and fierce, and Margaret Whitmore pressed her hands flat against her sides and moved forward. And she thought, not this time. Not this time. She found him exactly where Mrs. Aldridge said he would be. Samuel Carter was standing outside Dunmore's General Store with the relaxed, proprietary ease of a man who believed a town existed to receive him well. He was better dressed than she had imagined, from his letters, a good coat, a clean hat, boots that had been polished recently. He looked like a man who had spent money on appearing to be the kind of man who didn't have to spend money on appearances. He saw her coming from half a block away. She watched his face go through 3 separate expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and then the particular smooth rearrangement of features that belonged to a man deciding which version of himself to present. He settled on warm, slightly regretful, the expression of a man who hated that there had been a misunderstanding. "Miss Whitmore," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard you were still in the territory. I'm glad you landed somewhere safe." "I'm sure you are," Maggie said. She did not stop walking until she was close enough that lowering her voice was not necessary for the conversation to be private, and then she deliberately did not lower it, because she was not interested in a private conversation. 2 women from the dry goods shop had stopped on the opposite boardwalk. The man who ran the feed store was visible through his open window. "I'd like to ask you something, Mr. Carter, and I'd like you to answer it honestly. Which I understand may require more effort from you than it does from most people." Samuel's smile held. But something behind it went careful. "Now, Miss Whitmore, I know you came a long way and things didn't work out the way either of us. You told people in this town that I misunderstood your letters," she said. "I said there may have been some. I have the letters," she said. He stopped. "All 8 of them. I carried them in my bag across 600 miles because I am the kind of woman who keeps her documentation." She reached at the front pocket of her apron. She had not taken it off in her hurry, and later she would be glad of it, because the letters were in the deep pocket where she had placed them the morning she left Abilene, in a careful oilskin wrap, because she had known even then that paper could be a form of evidence. "Would you like me to read aloud the part where you wrote that you would be at the station yourself? Or the part where you wrote that you had discussed our arrangement with your lawyer and it was binding in good conscience?" The 2 women on the opposite boardwalk were not pretending to be elsewhere. The feed store man had appeared in his doorway. Samuel Carter looked at the letters. He looked at the growing number of people who were finding reasons to be on this particular stretch of boardwalk on this particular afternoon. And the warm, regretful expression finally dropped, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a mask dropped when the muscles behind it got tired. "You're making a scene," he said, quietly, with an edge under it. "I'm having a conversation," she said, "in public." "Which is my right." She held the letters at her side. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Mr. Carter. I'm here to tell you something clearly, so there is no possibility of misunderstanding which, as we've established, is a danger in our communications." She met his eyes. "I know what you wrote. I know what you promised. And I know that you made those promises while making other arrangements. Which means either you are a dishonest man or you are an extraordinarily careless one. And I find I don't have much use for either kind." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You have no idea what. I also know that you've been in Willow Creek for less than a day, and you've already spent part of that time telling people that I followed you here," she continued. "Which is not only false, but is precisely the kind of false story that a man tells when he's more worried about his own reputation than about the truth." She stepped back 1 pace, giving him space, but not retreating. "Say what you want about me in this town, Mr. Carter. I've spent 4 weeks here building something real, and the people who matter have seen me do it. Your version of the story won't find much purchase." She turned to go. "You don't know what you've walked into," he said. It was quiet, but it stopped her. She turned back slowly. "Excuse me?" His face had changed again. The smooth, managed surface was gone, and what was underneath it was not quite anger, and not quite fear, but something in between, the expression of a man who had just said something he hadn't meant to say, and was now deciding how much it mattered. "Dawson Ranch," he said. "You think you're building something real. You don't know what you're sitting in the middle of." Maggie looked at him. "If you have something to say," she said, "say it plainly." He looked at the people watching them. He looked at her. He looked at the letters she was still holding. Then he reset his hat and walked away without another word. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment after he left, looking at the space where he had been, and felt the cold that had been in her chest since Mrs. Aldridge's news turned into something sharper and less comfortable. "You don't know what you're sitting in the middle of." It was not a threat exactly. It was something worse, the deliberate offer of incomplete information from a man who had already demonstrated he used information as a tool. She folded the letters carefully. She put them back in her apron pocket. She nodded to the 2 women on the opposite boardwalk, who had the grace to look slightly embarrassed about the openness of their watching, and she walked back toward Dawson Ranch. She had 4 miles to think. By the time she reached the ranch gate, she had thought through everything she knew about Samuel Carter and arrived at the same conclusion from 4 different angles. He had come back to Willow Creek for a reason. The reason was not her; she was a complication he had expected to manage with rumors. And her response on the boardwalk had made that strategy significantly less viable. The reason was something else. Something in this county, on this land, that had brought him back with money in his coat and polish on his boots, and the easy confidence of a man who believed he was about to get what he came for. She found William at the north fence. He was working alongside Tom on the section that had needed repair longest. And he was focused and unhurried, the way he was when he was doing something physical and letting his mind run separately. He saw her coming across the pasture, and something in his posture changed, a slight tension. The kind that happened when a man recognized that news was arriving. She told him. All of it, Samuel's version of the story. The boardwalk conversation, every word of the exchange. And the last thing Samuel had said before he walked away. William listened without interrupting. His face was still while she talked, and she had learned to read that particular stillness by now. It was not blankness. It was the opposite of blankness. It was concentration. The stillness of a man taking everything in and sorting it at the same time. Tom had stopped working. He was listening too, with his arms folded and his expression doing the slow, controlled thing it did when he was angry, and had decided not to be hasty about it. When she finished, William said, "You don't know what you're sitting in the middle of." That's what he said, and he didn't explain it. He had an audience by that point. He decided against it. William looked at Tom. Tom looked back. Something passed between them, the shorthand communication of men who had worked alongside each other long enough to have entire conversations in the space of a look. "Tell her," William said. Tom unfolded his arms. He looked at Maggie with the expression of a man who had not decided to trust her and had now decided. "There's been a buyer moving through this county for about a year," he said. "Nobody local. Someone with backing real money, not ranch money. They've been approaching operations that are struggling and making offers. Not insultingly low, but well below the land value. Because they know most of the people they're approaching are desperate enough to consider it." He paused. 3 ranches in this county have sold in the last 18 months. All of them to a purchasing company called Western Land and Cattle, LLC, which nobody in the county can find a real name behind. All of them in areas that sit on or near the underground water table that serves the eastern quarter of the county. He looked at William. "Dawson Ranch sits on the deepest section of that table." Maggie stood very still. "Water rights," she said. "That's what we think," William said. "The county is growing, the town's growing. Whoever gets control of the primary water table controls the price of every well sunk in the next 20 years. And Samuel Carter," Maggie said slowly. "He sold his ranch to Western Land and Cattle," Tom said. "We found that out 3 weeks after he sold. We don't know if he was just a seller or something more." Maggie thought about the letters, about the careful handwriting, about a man who chose his words with deliberate intention. "I will be waiting at the station myself. You will not have to ask for directions." And who had then simply not come? Who had made other arrangements? "When he wrote to me," she said, "his ranch was still viable. He sold it several months later." She looked at William. Why would a man write to a woman about a future on a ranch he was planning to sell? William met her eyes. "Because he wasn't sure he was going to sell yet," he said quietly. "Or because he was already negotiating and wanted a backup plan if the sale fell through. Or he stopped. Or because he wanted someone on the inside of another ranch," she said. The word landed in the air between them like something physical. She heard herself say it and felt the cold move from her chest into her hands. Because it was not certain, she would not call anything certain that she didn't have documentation for, but it fit. It fit the way the falsified receipts fit the ledger, in the precise negative shape of the thing they were designed to conceal. A man who understood land acquisition, who had sold his own property to a company buying water rights, who had then written careful, promising letters to a woman with practical skills bookkeeping, record-keeping, account management, and arranged for her to come to a county where he had interests, to a ranch that sat on valuable water rights, to a situation where she would have access to the financial records of an operation the purchasing company wanted to acquire. "He expected me to work for him," she said. "Not with you. For him. I was supposed to come here, access your books somehow, and feed information back." "That's a theory," William said carefully. "I know it's a theory." She pressed her hands together. "But it explains why he didn't come to the station. He made other arrangements with the Houston woman and her family money. He didn't need me for companionship. He needed me for access. And when the situation changed, when I ended up at your ranch through a completely unplanned set of circumstances, he lost control of the situation." Tom said, very quietly, "That's why he came back. He came back to either re-establish contact," Maggie said, "or to damage my credibility before I figured it out." Nobody spoke for a moment. The wind moved through the pasture grass. The cattle made their low, indifferent sounds in the far distance. "I need to check something," Maggie said. She went back to the study. She pulled the ledgers, all 3, and she started at the beginning. Not looking for Pete Holloway's theft this time. Looking for something else. Looking for any correspondence, any notation, any reference to approach an offer, an inquiry, a conversation about the land or the water rights or anything adjacent to it. She found it in the second ledger, tucked inside the back cover, the way a man tucked something he wasn't sure what to do with, a letter, folded twice, on paper that was higher quality than ranch paper. No signature, no company name. Just a series of numbers that corresponded to acreage valuations. She recognized the format because she had worked with property assessments before, and a handwritten note at the bottom. "Consider carefully. The offer won't improve." WLC William had never mentioned a formal offer. She brought the letter to him. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "That came 8 months ago. I filed it because I didn't want to think about it." "Did you respond?" "No." "Do they know you didn't respond?" "Silence is usually interpreted as refusal," he said. Then, slower, "Or as a negotiating position, or as a man who doesn't know enough about his own finances to know whether he can afford to refuse," she said. Which, 8 months ago, was true. He looked at her. "Because of Pete," he said. "Because of Pete. Your books were a mess, and your financial picture was distorted. You couldn't see clearly enough to know whether you could hold on. And someone who knew that someone who understood the ranch's situation from the inside would have known that a man in that position was more vulnerable." William set the letter on the desk. He put both hands flat on the surface and looked at the wall for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something. He thought he had understood. "Pete came with a reference from the Garner operation," he said. "In Bexar County," she said, "which sold to Western Land and Cattle 14 months ago." Tom appeared in the doorway. He had followed them inside, without either of them noticing. He looked at the letter on the desk and said, flatly, "Pete wasn't a thief who happened to work for a land scheme." "He was part of it, I think so," Maggie said. "I think he was placed here. The theft was real. Men like that don't pass up an opportunity, but the primary purpose was to keep the books in enough confusion that William couldn't accurately assess his own position. A man who doesn't know whether he can survive another year is much more likely to sell." The study was very quiet. Jesse appeared behind Tom, because Jesse had a sixth sense for rooms where important things were happening. He took in the expressions of the people in the room and said, very quietly, "How bad is this?" "We don't know yet," William said. He looked at Maggie. "What do we need to know?" "We need to know who is behind Western Land and Cattle," she said. "A company that holds property needs to be registered somewhere. If the purchases in this county are all recorded at the county land office, the deeds will show the purchasing entity, and a purchasing entity registered in Texas will have documentation somewhere with a real name attached." "The county land office," William said. "And the state registry in Austin, if the county records are incomplete." He looked at Tom. Tom looked at Jesse. Jesse looked at Maggie. "I'll ride to the land office first thing tomorrow," William said. "I'll come with you," Maggie said. He started to say something. "Mr. Dawson," she said, "I know what to look for in a deed. You know what questions to ask because you know this county and these people. Together, we'll find it faster than either of us will separately." He closed his mouth. "All right," he said. First light. They rode into town the next morning, before most of Willow Creek was awake. The county land office opened at 8, and the clerk, a thin young man named Aldous, who clearly did not expect company this early and had been in the middle of eating a biscuit when they arrived, looked at them with the baffled expression of someone trying to remember if he had scheduled an appointment and coming up blank. William explained what they needed. Deed records for the properties that had transferred in the last 18 months. Purchasing entity documentation. Aldous put down his biscuit. He disappeared into the back and came out 20 minutes later with 3 folders and an expression that said he had spent those 20 minutes deciding how he felt about the request. "These are public records," he said. "I'm required to provide access." "We know," William said pleasantly. "Thank you, Aldous." They took the folders to the reading table. Maggie opened the first one. The deed for the Harmon property, sold 16 months ago, listed the purchasing entity as Western Land and Cattle, LLC, registered in Galveston. She wrote that down. The Peterson property, sold 12 months ago, listed the same entity with the same registration. The Morrison property, the most recent transfer, 8 months prior, listed Western Land and Cattle, LLC, and below the company name, as required by the transfer documentation. Authorized signatory, R.E. Galloway, Director. She wrote the name down. She showed it to William. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "Richard Galloway." Not a question. In a tone that suggested the name was not unfamiliar. "You know him?" "I know of him. He's out of San Antonio. He backed the rail extension 2 years ago. There was a dispute about the route because it went through 3 ranches, and the landowner said they weren't fairly compensated. He looked at the name on the deed. He won. The rail went through. The ranchers got what Galloway decided they should get, and there wasn't much they could do about it, because by the time they understood the situation, he already held the notes on their mortgages. He buys the debt first, Maggie said. Then he has leverage. That's how he works. She looked at the deed. She looked at the signature. She looked at William. Does he hold any notes on Dawson Ranch? The question landed in the air between them like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples were visible on William's face, something moving in his expression that she had not seen before, something that was not the careful steadiness he usually wore. No, he said. I bought this land outright, 12 years ago. Cash. Clara insisted on it. She said she didn't want to owe anyone the right to stay on her own land. The thing in his expression when he said Clara's name was old and private and passed quickly, but she had seen it and filed it where she filed everything carefully, without drawing premature conclusions. Then he can't come at you through debt, she said. No. Which means he needs either to make you desperate enough to sell voluntarily, or to find something else to use as leverage. She looked at the folder. The confusion in the books would have served the first purpose, making you think the ranch was failing when it wasn't. And Carter, William said. His voice had gone quiet. What was Carter's role in this? Exactly. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He may have been a willing participant. He may have been used the same way you were nearly used, brought into proximity, without understanding the full picture. She looked at her notes. But I'd like to find out how. The letter you filed in the ledger, the one with the WLC initials. It came in writing, which means someone delivered it. Which means someone in this town either brought it or knows who did. Aldous, at the front desk, had gone very still in the particular way of young men who were pretending not to listen to a conversation they were absolutely listening to. Maggie looked at him. He looked at his biscuit. Aldous, she said pleasantly. He looked up with the expression of a man who had been caught. The property transfers in these folders, she said. Did the same person file all three? He hesitated. It's a public record question, William said. Aldous looked at his biscuit again. Then he looked at them. The first two were filed by a lawyer from San Antonio. Name on the filings was Prescott, Hale and Associates. He paused. The third one was hand-delivered by a local man. Another pause. He asked me not to say. William looked at him steadily. Aldous, he said, I've known your father for 15 years. I am asking you as a neighbor, not as anything else. Who hand-delivered the Morrison deed? Aldous had the particular suffering expression of a young man caught between two loyalties, one of which was significantly more immediate and consequential than the other. Carter, he said finally. Samuel Carter brought in the Morrison deed. The room was very quiet. Maggie looked at William. William looked at her. Not surprised, neither of them were surprised. Exactly. But confirmation was its own kind of thing. It was the moment a theory stopped being a theory and became a fact, and facts had weight that theories didn't, and that weight settled into the room with a solidity that neither of them had expected to feel quite this quickly. He was working for Galloway, William said. At minimum, he was working with him, Maggie said, on the Morrison deal, and he came to Willow Creek a year before the Morrison deal. Yes. Which means this has been a long game, she said. And we've just found the edge of it. William paid Aldous for the copies of the deed records and thanked him with a gravity that made the young man stand up slightly straighter. They walked out of the land office into the full morning heat, and William stood on the boardwalk for a moment, with the folder under his arm and the look of a man reassessing a landscape he thought he had known. He targeted you from the beginning, Maggie said. Before Pete, before me, before any of it. He identified your ranch as the priority holding because of the water rights, and he began building a way in, and you were supposed to be part of that, William said. It was not an accusation. It was the plain statement of something that was true and that he was looking at without flinching. I was supposed to be part of it, she agreed. I wasn't. No. He looked at her. You weren't. There was a pause. What do we do now? She asked. He thought for a moment. He looked down the main street of Willow Creek, the general store. The feed store, the bank, the church at the far end, with the expression of a man who was looking at the bones of a thing and deciding how to rebuild it. We go to the other families, the ones who sold, the Harmons, the Petersons, the Morrisons. They deserve to know that the company that bought their land is being run by a man who makes a practice of this. If they were pressured, if the notes on their mortgages were being held as leverage, there may be legal remedy. And Galloway himself, she said. We can't go at a man like Galloway with theory, he said. We need something documented, something that ties him directly to the pressure being applied, the fraudulent bookkeeping. Carter's involvement, all of it. I can document the accounting manipulation, she said. I already have the evidence of what Pete did. If we can establish that Pete was connected to Galloway's operation, the reference from the Garner operation, William said, which sold to Western land and cattle. I'll write to the people who ran it, she said. Before they sold. If Pete worked there, they may know something about who placed him there. He looked at her. You've been thinking about this since last night, he said. Since the boardwalk, she corrected. When Carter said I didn't know what I was sitting in the middle of, she met his eyes. I don't like not knowing what I'm sitting in the middle of. Something in William's expression did the thing she had come to watch for, the slow movement toward something that was honest and unguarded and came from a place below the practical surface of him. Miss Whitmore, he said. Yes? I'm glad it was you, he said quietly. I'm glad you were the one on that station bench. She looked at him for a moment. The morning moved around them, a wagon passing, someone calling across the street, the ordinary noise of a small town going about its business, and Maggie Whitmore stood on the boardwalk outside the county land office with a folder of deed and letters in her apron pocket and the particular feeling of a person who had just realized that what they had thought was a detour was not a detour at all. It was exactly where they were supposed to be. So am I, she said. They rode back to the ranch, and neither of them said anything for most of the 4 miles. Because what needed to be next was not something that could be said on a road in the morning light, with everything still uncertain, and a man named Galloway still holding what he held. But it had been said, and it did not need to be said again to be true. The letters went out that afternoon to the former owners of the Garner operation in Bexar County, to the families who had sold to Western land and cattle, to a lawyer William knew in Austin who specialized in land disputes and had a reputation for taking cases that other people considered impolitic. Maggie sealed each one herself. She put them in the mail pouch. She watched Tom ride them into town, and then she sat at the desk in the study, with the deeds and the ledgers, and the original WLC letter arranged in front of her, and she built a document methodical, precise, sourced from every piece of evidence she had, that told the complete story of what had been done to Dawson Ranch and by whom and how. She worked until the light failed. When she came out, William was on the porch. He handed her a cup of coffee without a word. They sat in the dark for a while, both of them looking at the same invisible distance, and somewhere in the night a coyote called from the far pasture, and the cattle moved and settled and were still. Are you afraid? He asked. She thought about it honestly. A little, she said. Men like Galloway don't respond well to being found out. No, he said. They don't. Are you? He was quiet for a moment. I'm afraid of losing this place, he said. I've been afraid of it for 9 years. Since Clara, he paused. But I'm less afraid than I was a month ago. She looked at him sideways in the dark. Why? He looked at his coffee. He looked at the night. Because a month ago, I was afraid and alone, he said simply. That's worse. Maggie held her cup with both hands and looked at the dark pasture and said nothing. Because there was nothing to add to that. It was simply true. The way the best things were true, without decoration or explanation. And from somewhere far out in the night, the coyote called again. And this time, nothing answered, and the silence after it was not empty, but full of the particular quality of 2 people sitting in the dark together, carrying something heavy, and finding that it was lighter than it had been before. The first response arrived 9 days after the letters went out. It came from Owen Harmon, the man who had sold his family's property to Western land and cattle 16 months ago, and according to county records, had received 40% below assessed land value for the privilege. He rode to Dawson Ranch himself, rather than writing back. Arriving on a Thursday morning with the particular expression of a man who had been carrying something in his chest for over a year and had finally been given permission to set it down. Maggie was in the study when William brought him in. She heard them in the hallway, William's voice, low and steady, Owen's rougher with something ragged underneath it, and then William appeared in the doorway and said, "Simply, he wants to tell you himself." Owen Harmon was 62 years old and had the hands of a man who had worked land for 40 years. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at Maggie and said, "A man came to see me in February of last year. He said he was a land assessor. He went over the whole property. He said the water table under my east pasture was compromised contaminations from old mining activity 2 counties over. He said, was spreading through the underground system. He said, if I didn't sell before it was formally documented, I'd have nothing. No buyer would touch it." He paused. He looked at his hands. "I asked him to show me the contamination report," he said. He said it wasn't public yet. He said he was telling me as a courtesy, because he'd known my father. He paused again. I never verified that. Either that he'd known my father. I was 61 years old, and my wife had been sick and I was tired. And someone gave me a reason to be afraid and I took it. He looked up. Was any of it true? No, Maggie said. I've checked the county geological surveys. The water table under your east pasture is the same quality it has been for 30 years. The assessment your visitor gave you was fabricated. Owen Harmon sat very still. Then he said something quiet and specific that was not suitable for polite company. And neither William nor Maggie said a word about it, because it was the most reasonable thing he had said since he arrived. He stole my land, Owen said. Not a question. The flat statement of a man finishing a calculation he should have been able to finish a year ago, if someone had given him the numbers. A man told me a lie, and I sold my family's land for less than half because I believed him. Yes, Maggie said. What can I do about it? She looked at William. William looked at her. She turned back to Owen and said, the lawyer in Austin, the one William wrote to, thinks there may be a case for rescission of the contract on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. It's not simple, and it's not fast, but if the man who gave you that false assessment can be identified and connected to Western land and cattle, the sale itself may be voidable. Owen absorbed this slowly. Rescission. You could get your land back, she said carefully. Or fair market compensation. I can't promise which, and I can't promise the timeline, but the evidence exists. We just need to build the full picture of how it was done. What do you need from me? Everything you remember about the man who came to see you. How he made contact. Exactly what he said. Whether he gave you anything in writing. Owen reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the creases from repeated handling. I've been carrying this since the day he left, he said. I don't know why. I kept thinking I should throw it away. But I never could. He laid it on the table. It was a single page typed, not handwritten, which told Maggie immediately that it had been prepared in advance rather than composed on site. It bore no letterhead, but at the bottom, in a different typeface from the body of the document, was a reference number, a filing code. She recognized the format. It was a Western Land and Cattle Internal Document reference. She had seen the same format on the letter filed in William's ledger, the one with the WLC initials. She looked at William. He was already looking at her. It's the same company, she said. The same documentation system. William placed his hand flat on the table beside the paper. The way he did when something needed to be anchored. Can we keep this? You can have it, Owen said. I never want to see it again as long as I live. By the end of the following week, 2 more former landowners had come to Dawson Ranch. James Peterson, who had sold his property after being told a new rail line would run directly through his north pasture, a rail line that had never materialized. And Dorothy Morrison, a widow who had sold within 3 months of her husband's death, After a man she described as very kind and very patient explained to her that without a husband to manage the operation, she would lose the property to debt within 2 years, regardless, and that selling now was the compassionate thing to do for her children. Dorothy Morrison was 58 years old, and she sat at William's kitchen table, and she did not cry. But it was a close thing, and Mrs. Aldrich put a cup of tea in front of her and stood beside the table in a way that made it plain she would stand there as long as was needed. I believed him, Dorothy said. He had such a kind face. I thought he was looking out for my family. He knew how to look like that, Maggie said. That's what men like this do. They find the thing that makes you afraid, and they give it a face. Dorothy looked at her. You sound like you've been afraid of the same thing. I have, Maggie said. I believed someone, too, not long ago. I traveled a long way on the strength of it. She met Dorothy's eyes directly. But the believing wasn't the mistake. The mistake was his. What a man does with your trust is his failure, not yours. Dorothy held her teacup with both hands. She looked at William, who was sitting at the end of the table with the ledgers and the deeds, and the growing stack of documentations spread before him like the evidence file it was increasingly becoming. What happens now, she asked. With all of this? The lawyer in Austin has been in contact, William said. He wants to come to Willow Creek. He thinks we have enough for an injunction, a court order, preventing any further land transfers while the fraudulent inducement claims are investigated. Will that stop Galloway? It will slow him, William said. And it will make what he's doing visible, which is something else entirely. Men like Galloway operate on invisibility. When you can see exactly what they're doing, the whole thing looks different. Dorothy set down her teacup. She straightened in her chair with the specific posture of a woman, remembering something she had temporarily mislaid her own backbone. Tell me what you need me to do, she said. And that's how Dawson Ranch became. In the space of a week, something it had never been intended to be, a gathering place. Tom rode to 3 neighboring operations and left word. Jesse, who turned out to have a genuine talent for knowing which people in the county trusted which other people, made 4 separate visits in 2 days and came back each time, having added names to the list of those who were willing to talk. Elliot, who had said very little since he arrived, but had watched everything with quiet, thorough attention, mentioned on a Thursday evening that his cousin had worked for the Garner operation in Bexar County before it sold, and if Maggie wanted someone to vouch for her letter, he could write a separate one. Please, she said immediately. He wrote it that night. He was not a literate man. In the formal sense, his handwriting was slow and deliberate, and his sentences were short, but what he wrote was clear and specific and true. And Maggie had learned a long time ago that those 3 qualities were worth more than elegance. The letter from Bexar County came back 10 days later. She read it in the study, and then she sat with it for a moment, before she called for William, because she needed a moment to understand what she was looking at. Pete Holloway had worked for the Garner operation for 3 months before it sold. He had been placed there by a man who had represented himself as an employment agent. The man's description: medium height, careful dresser, very pleasant, very patient, matched the description Dorothy Morrison had given of the man who had visited her after her husband's death. And in the former owner's careful, blocky handwriting, at the end of the letter, the employment agent gave me a card. I still have it. The name on the card was R. Galloway. LCA, she called for William. He read the letter standing in the doorway of the study. She watched his face process it, the quick movement of his eyes, the slight tightening of his jaw, and then the careful stillness. That meant he was deciding something. LCA, he said. Land and Cattle Associates, she said. Western Land and Cattle is the purchasing arm. LCA is the parent operation. Galloway runs both. He places the people himself, William said. He finds the target, identifies the vulnerability, places someone inside the operation, and then applies pressure from outside, while his inside man creates confusion in the books. He looked up from the letter. This is not something he invented for this county. He's done this before. Almost certainly, she said. Which means there are other counties, other families. Other operations that sold because someone came to them with a kind face and a frightening story. William set the letter on the desk. He looked at Maggie. "We have to send everything to Austin," he said. "All of it. Every piece of documentation. We have the ledger evidence. The deed records Aldous' testimony about who filed the Morrison deed. This letter, Owen Harmon's document, everything Dorothy Morrison can give us." He paused. "This is bigger than Willow Creek." "Yes," she said. "It is." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, I want to ask you something. And I want you to tell me if it's too much." She waited. "Will you go to Austin with me?" he said. "The lawyer Hendricks, he needs someone who can walk him through the accounting evidence. He needs someone who can explain what was done to the books and how and why. In terms a court will understand. I can talk about the land. I can talk about the water rights. But the financial manipulation," he stopped. "That's yours. You built that case. I don't want anyone else presenting it." Maggie looked at him. She thought about the train that had brought her to Willow Creek. The leather bag, the $3.40. The letter in her apron pocket that she had carried for 6 weeks because she was the kind of woman who kept her documentation. "When do we leave?" she said. They left on a Monday. On the early train. Mrs. Aldridge had packed food for the journey with the focused efficiency of a woman who expressed her feelings through practicality. And Tom had stood at the wagon and given William a long look that communicated approximately 30 separate things. And William had given him a look back that answered most of them. Jessie had simply said, "Give Galloway my regards. Specifically my boot." "I'll pass that along," William said gravely. The train ride to Austin was 4 hours. They sat across from each other with the documentation case between them. Maggie had organized everything into a single leather case that William had produced from somewhere in the ranch house. Old and slightly battered, with brass buckles that still worked. She had the contents arranged in order of evidentiary weight, with a separate summary document she had written herself that laid out the entire scheme in chronological sequence. They didn't talk about the case for the first hour. There was nothing left to say about it that hadn't been said. And they both knew it. The work was done. The evidence was sound. And the next part belonged to Hendricks and the law. What they talked about instead was smaller and more particular. The ranch as it would look in spring if the herd recovered as projected. Whether Elliot was going to work out long term, William thought yes. Maggie agreed. And they both agreed without saying it directly that his quiet steadiness was something the ranch had needed before they understood they needed it. Whether Jessie would eventually settle or whether he was the kind of man who needed to move through 3 or 4 lives before he found the one that fit. "What kind of man were you?" she asked. "Before you settled." He considered the question with the seriousness he gave everything. "I moved twice," he said. "Missouri to Texas. Each time, I thought I was looking for something practical, better land, better prices. Clara used to say I was looking for the same thing as everyone else. I just didn't know what to call it." "What did she call it?" "Home," he said. "She said everyone was looking for home, and most people tried to find it in places instead of people. And that was why so many of them kept moving." He paused. "She was smarter than me about most things." "She sounds like she was," Maggie said. "She would have liked you," he said. It came out simply, without thinking about it, and she could see from the slight shift in his expression that it had come from somewhere below the careful, deliberate surface of him without his full intention. He looked out the window for a moment. "I'm sorry." "That was don't apologize for it," she said quietly. He looked back at her. "I'm glad," she said. "I mean that." The train moved through the country, and neither of them said anything further for a while. And it was the particular silence of 2 people who had just said something true and were letting it settle before adding anything that might diminish it. Hendricks was a small, brisk man in his 50s who wore very good suits and had the focused energy of someone who ran on 4 hours of sleep and considered this a reasonable arrangement. He met them at the station and had them in his office within the hour. And by the time Maggie had laid out the first 3 documents, He had stopped pretending to take notes and was simply listening with the concentrated intensity of a man hearing exactly what he needed to hear. She walked him through all of it. The ledger manipulation, the false supply orders, the placement of Pete Holloway via Galloway's own employment agency, the contamination scare used to pressure Owen Harmon, the false rail line told to James Peterson, the widow's story and the kind face and the manufactured urgency designed to push Dorothy Morrison into a decision before grief could lift enough for her to think clearly. When she finished, Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long did it take you to compile this?" 5 weeks, she said. "From the time I identified the first anomaly in the ledgers." He looked at William. "Is she always like this?" "She identified the first anomaly on her first evening at the ranch," William said. "So yes, I believe she is." Hendricks looked back at Maggie with the expression of a man recalibrating a situation he had walked into expecting one thing and found another. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I have been practicing law in this state for 22 years, and I have been handed evidence packages by sheriffs, by detectives, and by men whose entire professional purpose was building documentation of exactly this kind. And I can tell you with complete sincerity that what you have given me this afternoon is better organized, more thoroughly sourced, and more legally actionable than most of what I have received from all of those sources combined." Maggie looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "Can we stop him?" "Yes," Hendricks said. He said it with the flat certainty of a man who had just seen the cards and done the count. "Yes, it will take time, 6 months, possibly a year before anything goes to a full hearing. But the injunction I can file within the week, which stops any further transfers and freezes WLC's ability to act in this county." He looked at both of them. "Galloway will fight it. He has money and he has lawyers and he will use both." "We know," William said. "And you're prepared to see it through?" "Yes," William said. Hendricks looked at Maggie. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, with the satisfied brevity of a man who appreciated people who said yes and meant it without requiring further discussion. "Then go home," he said. "Let me do the next part. I'll be in contact within 10 days. They left his office into the late Austin afternoon and stood on the street outside with the leather case between them and the particular, fragile lightness of people who had been carrying something heavy and had just handed it to someone capable of bearing it. "That's done," William said. "The beginning of it," she said. "The beginning of it," he agreed. He looked at her. "Are you hungry? We have 3 hours before the return train." "Yes," she said. "I'm very hungry. I didn't eat anything on the train because I was reviewing the documentation." He looked at her, popped the expression that had become familiar, the combination of exasperation and something warmer that he did not always intend to show. "You had 4 hours on a train," he said, "and 27 documents to review. Mr. Dawson, there is a restaurant 2 blocks from here that has existed for 20 years and is therefore presumably doing something right," he said. "Will you have supper with me?" It was not quite a question. She looked at him. He was standing in the afternoon light of an Austin street with a battered leather case at his feet and his hat slightly crooked from the train. And he had the look of a man who had asked a simple question and was waiting for a simple answer, except that they both understood it was not entirely simple, and neither of them was pretending otherwise. "Yes," she said, "I will." The restaurant was quiet at that hour. The in-between time when the lunch crowd had gone and the supper crowd hadn't arrived. They took a corner table. They ordered without consulting each other about it, which was something that happened when 2 people had eaten enough meals together that their rhythms had synchronized without announcement. The food came, they ate, and somewhere in the middle of a meal that was not complicated or significant in any external sense, just 2 people eating supper in a quiet restaurant in a city that was not their own, William set down his fork and said, "I need to tell you something." She set down her fork too. "All right," she said. He looked at the table for a moment. The deliberate pause of a man choosing words that mattered. "When Clara died," he said, "I decided I was done. Not dramatically, I didn't say it to anyone. I barely said it to myself. But I made a decision, somewhere very quiet inside myself, that I was done with the particular vulnerability of loving someone who could be taken from you. He looked up. I told myself it was sensible, that I had the ranch and the work, and that was enough for a man. That expecting more was foolish. He paused. I've told myself that for 9 years. She waited. And then you got off a wagon in front of my house, he said. With $3.40 and my ledgers in shreds, and Pete Holloway stealing me blind and a scheme I couldn't see. And in 5 weeks, you fixed everything I couldn't fix in 9 years, and you did it without asking my permission and without apologizing for being capable. And he stopped. He picked up his fork and put it down again. I don't know how to do this, he said. I have not done this in a long time. But I think I would very much like to try. Maggie looked at him. She had learned to read him over 5 weeks, the careful pace of a man who didn't say things he didn't mean, who didn't offer what he wasn't prepared to give, who tested the ground before committing his weight. She had watched that process with every practical matter on the ranch, and she understood now that it was not a character limitation, but a character feature, the particular trustworthiness of a man who moved slowly because he moved honestly. I would like that too, she said. I would like that very much. He looked at her. That's all, he said. What else would you like me to say? I don't know. Something more complicated, perhaps, given who you are. I save complicated for the things that are complicated, she said. This isn't. The corner of his mouth moved. Then, for the first time since she had known him, for the first time since the station bench and the wagon and the kitchen table and the ledgers and the boardwalk and the deeds and the train, William Dawson smiled. Not the fractional, almost smile she had been cataloging for 5 weeks. A real one. The full version of a thing that had been held in reserve for 9 years. And that looked, when it finally arrived, like exactly what it was. A man deciding to be glad again. Maggie looked at that smile and felt something unlock in her chest that she had not known was still locked. All right, he said, supper then, and then home. Home, she said. And the word, in her mouth, in that quiet restaurant, in that city, in that moment landed differently than it ever had before. Not like a destination, not like a promise someone else had made and broken. Like something she was building herself, with her own hands, from the ground up. Like something real. They caught the evening train back to Willow Creek, and the country rolled past the window in the last light. And neither of them slept, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything, because the silence itself had become something they shared. And sharing it was enough, and the train moved through the dark toward the ranch, and the cattle and the people who were waiting, and the work that was not finished but had finally, at last found its proper footing. The injunction arrived in Willow Creek on a Thursday morning, and by noon the entire county knew about it. Hendricks had moved faster than he predicted, 7 days instead of 10, and the court order was precise and comprehensive. Western Land and Cattle LLC and all associated entities operating under R. Galloway were prohibited from initiating or completing any property transfer in the county, pending a full investigation into fraudulent inducement claims brought by Owen Harmon, James Peterson, and Dorothy Morrison. The order named Samuel Carter as a material witness. It referenced the accounting documentation compiled by Margaret Whitmore of Dawson Ranch. Her name was in a court document. She read it twice at the kitchen table, holding the copy Hendricks had sent with his accompanying letter, and felt something move through her that she didn't immediately have a word for. Not pride exactly. Something more fundamental. The particular sensation of a person discovering that what they built in the dark, when nobody was watching, was solid enough to stand in the full light of a legal proceeding. William was watching her read it. How does it feel? He asked. She set the document down. She looked at it for another moment. Like something I did matters, she said. I've done a lot of things that mattered to the specific situation in front of me. This is the first time something I built is going to matter to people I've never met. He nodded. He understood that distinction precisely. Tom came in from the barn and picked up the document without asking and read it in his steady, unhurried way. When he finished, he set it back down on the table and said, "Good." It was the same word he had said when William went to the sheriff about Pete Holloway. Single syllable, absolute, the complete statement of a man who did not require more words to mean a complete thing. Jesse read it next, and his reaction was characteristically different. He read it twice, very fast, and then stood up from his chair and pointed at the document and said, "That's Maggie's name right there in an actual court paper, with the specific, proprietary pride of someone claiming partial credit for something they had watched happen from a close distance. I'm telling everyone I know." "Please don't," Maggie said. "I'm telling Tom's cousin. He's very discreet, Jesse," Tom said. "Telling him quietly," Jesse said, and went back outside. The days that followed had a different quality than the weeks before. The work continued. The ranch did not pause for legal proceedings, and the cattle had no opinions about injunctions, but underneath the ordinary rhythm of it, something had shifted. People came by, not just the 3 families directly named in the suit, but neighbors, people from neighboring operations, people who had heard something and wanted to understand it. William received them with the same steady, practical directness he gave everything. And Maggie sat at the kitchen table with the documentation spread before her and answered questions with the calm specificity of a woman who had organized her evidence so thoroughly that she could retrieve any piece of it from memory. Dorothy Morrison came back twice. The second time, she brought her eldest daughter, a serious young woman of about 20, who sat beside her mother and listened to Maggie explain the accounting manipulation with the focused attention of someone filing everything away for future use. "How did you learn to do this?" the daughter asked. "To read accounts like that. Practice," Maggie said. "And necessity. When you can't afford for things to go wrong, you learn to see where they might." The young woman was quiet for a moment. Then could someone learn it, if they didn't already know? Maggie looked at her. "Yes," she said, "it's not a gift. It's a skill. It can be taught." The young woman, her name was Ruth, came back the following Tuesday on her own. She sat at the study table and Maggie spent 2 hours showing her the basic principles of double-entry bookkeeping. By the end of the session, Ruth had found 2 errors in a practice ledger Maggie had constructed from old supply records, and she had found them faster than Maggie expected. "You have a good eye," Maggie told her. Ruth looked at the ledger with the expression of a person discovering something about themselves. "I always thought I was just good at noticing when things didn't add up," she said. "I didn't know that was the same thing." "It's exactly the same thing," Maggie said. She thought about that conversation for a long time afterward. She thought about it while she worked through the ranch accounts, which were now so clean and current that they practically managed themselves. She thought about it while she sat on the porch in the evenings with William, in the silence that had become its own kind of language between them. She thought about it until the shape of an idea became clear enough to name. "I want to open an accounting service," she told William one evening. Not tentatively, as a statement of intention already formed. He looked at her. "In town, one morning a week to start. There are women in this county, widows, women whose husbands don't have a head for numbers, women running businesses on their own who are making decisions blind because they can't read their own accounts and can't afford to hire someone who can." She looked at her hands. "I can read accounts. I can teach people to read them." And if someone had been available to Dorothy Morrison before her husband died, if someone had simply sat with her and shown her what the numbers meant, she would not have been vulnerable to a man who came to her door with a kind face and a terrible lie. William was quiet for a long moment. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since Ruth," she said. "Since watching her find those errors and realizing she didn't know she could do that. She knew the skill existed in theory and didn't know it existed in herself." She looked at him. "How many other women are like that? In this county alone?" He thought about it. "A lot. Yes," she said. He looked at her with the expression. She knew now, the one that was not the careful, measured face he showed the world, but the thing underneath it. The thing that moved toward her without entirely meaning to. "You're going to change this county," he said. Not a compliment. An observation. The plain assessment of a man who dealt in facts. "I'm going to try," she said. "That's the same thing," he said. "For you." She looked at him. The evening was settling around them, and somewhere, in the south pasture, the cattle were making their end-of-day sounds, and Mrs. Aldrich could be heard moving through the kitchen with her usual purposeful efficiency. And this was this specific moment, with the accounts clean and the work real, and the idea forming, and this man beside her. This was the life that had been on the other side of the closed door she had stood outside of, in Willow Creek, 6 weeks ago. She had not known it existed. She had not known to want it. She was so glad she hadn't been given the life she thought she was coming for. The hearing in Austin was set for early November, 6 weeks from the injunction. In the intervening weeks, Hendricks built the case with the methodical efficiency of a man who understood how to construct an argument from evidence. And he sent regular correspondence to Dawson Ranch that Maggie read and annotated and sent back with questions that Hendricks described. In one letter, as exactly the right questions, asked in exactly the right order. What none of them anticipated was Samuel Carter. The letter arrived on a Wednesday addressed to Maggie, not to William, at the ranch address. The handwriting was the same careful, deliberate script she had memorized from 8 letters she carried in her apron pocket. She recognized it before she opened it and felt something cold and specific move through her. Not quite fear, but the preparatory version of it, the tightening of everything in anticipation of something difficult. She opened it at the kitchen table, alone, because she wanted to read it once before she decided what it meant. "Miss Whitmore," it began, "I am not writing to defend myself. I am past the point where defense is useful, and you are not a woman who would find it convincing in any case. I am writing because Hendricks's subpoena reached me yesterday, and because I believe, on reflection, that the only thing I can do of any value at this point is tell you what I know completely rather than what I am required to tell you minimally." She read the rest of it without stopping. When she finished, she sat very still for a full minute. Then she said, "William." He appeared in the doorway. She held out the letter. He read it standing. She watched his face, the careful, tracking attention he gave to things that mattered, and she saw the moment the key information landed, the slight change in his breathing, the stillness that followed. He lowered the letter. "He's going to testify for us," William said. "Voluntarily," she said, "before Hendricks formally compels him." Why? She had been asking herself that since the 3rd paragraph. He says in the letter that Galloway told him the water contamination story was true, that he genuinely believed the Harmon property was devalued by contamination, and that the families were being offered fair value given the circumstances. She paused. He says he found out in August that the contamination was fabricated, that he went to Galloway, and Galloway told him to leave it alone, and he left it alone, William said, until the injunction named him as a material witness. She looked at the letter. "I don't know whether to believe him." "Does it matter?" William asked. She thought about it. "For the case, no. His testimony is the same regardless of his reasons for giving it." But she paused. "I came a long way on the strength of his words once. And you want to know if the words mean anything this time?" "Yes," she said. "I want to know that." William looked at the letter. He looked at her. The things he told the families, the contamination, the rail line, the widow he says he didn't know, those were lies. That's what he says. Do you believe he didn't know about the widow? Dorothy Morrison? She thought about the kind face Dorothy had described. The patience, the manufactured urgency designed to push a grieving woman into a decision before her mind cleared. "No," she said quietly. "I don't believe he didn't know about that. Then he's not a man who told one lie and then discovered his conscience," William said. "He's a man who decided which lies he could live with and is now deciding that his current situation requires him to stop living with them." He looked at her steadily. "That's a different thing, and it's still useful." "Yes," she said. "Write to Hendricks tonight." She did. Hendricks's response was, characteristically, brisk. "Carter's voluntary testimony substantially strengthens our position, particularly regarding the contamination fraud. for which Owen Harmon's case required establishing intent. Carter's direct account of Galloway's instruction to leave it alone after the fabrication was revealed is the closest thing to a confession we are likely to get. Prepare Miss Whitmore to testify. She will likely be called upon to explain the accounting documentation in detail. Tell her to bring everything. She was going to testify. She held that fact in her hands for an evening and felt the weight of it, not the weight of fear, but the weight of responsibility. There would be a room. There would be a judge. There would be lawyers and Galloway's money, and Galloway's lawyers, and the full machinery of a man who had been doing this for years, and had presumably been through legal challenges before, and had presumably prevailed in most of them. And there would be her with the documentation. "Are you ready?" William asked. "I'm ready," she said. "I've been ready since I found the first falsified receipt." He looked at her with the expression that still, even after 6 weeks, moved something in her chest. "I know," he said. "I just wanted to hear you say it." The night before the hearing, neither of them slept much. They sat on the porch long after Mrs. Aldridge had gone to bed, and the hands had settled into their respective quiet. The dark was full, and the stars were dense, and the air had the particular clarity of a Texas night in late October, cool and still and sharp. "Tell me about the first case you ever worked on," William said. "Not about the hearing, about her." The deliberate pivot of a man choosing to be present with the person rather than the situation. She smiled. "It wasn't a case. I was 16. My father had hired a man to sell a bull, and the man came back with $15 less than the agreed price, and a story about the buyer changing the terms at the last minute. I went through my father's notes. He kept terrible notes, just scraps of paper, and I found a record of the original agreement. $15 difference. Exact amount." She paused. "I told my father. He went back to the man. The man returned the $15 and never worked for us again." "And your father?" "He was astonished," she said. "He said, 'How did you find that?' I said, 'Because I was looking.' He said, 'I didn't know you were watching the accounts.' I said, 'Someone had to.'" William was quiet. "You've been doing this your whole life. Watching. Making sure the numbers told the truth." "Yes. And nobody ever told you it mattered." She thought about that. "Not until now," she said. He turned to look at her. Directly, without the casual glance of conversation. The full attention of a man saying something he had thought about carefully. "It matters," he said. "What you do, the way you look at things. The way you find what's been hidden and make it visible, it matters enormously. It protected my ranch. It's going to give 3 families their land back. And whatever you do, next the service in town, the teaching that's going to matter to people who don't even know your name yet." He held her gaze. "I need you to know that I see it. All of it. Not just the useful parts. The whole of it." Maggie looked at him for a long moment. 9 years ago, a woman named Clara had told this man that everyone was looking for home, and most people tried to find it in places. And he had remembered it. He had carried it across 9 years of solitude and held it carefully, and then, on an evening in late October, on the porch of a ranch that was now clean and stable and genuinely his, he had handed it to her in the form of, "I see all of it." "I know you do," she said. "That's the thing about you that I noticed first." "That I see things?" "That you see people," she said. "You saw me on that station bench and you didn't see a problem, or a charity case, or a useful pair of hands. You saw a person." She paused. "Most people don't do that." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not dramatically quietly, the way he did everything. With the unhurried certainty of a man who had decided and was not taking it back. His hand was warm and rough and very steady. She held it. They sat like that for a long time, in the dark and the stars and the particular silence of a place that had been a lonely ranch and was now, unmistakably, something else. The hearing lasted 2 days. Galloway arrived with 3 lawyers and the composed, slightly bored expression of a man who had been through this before and expected to prevail through attrition if nothing else. He was older than Maggie had pictured, mid-60s, silver-haired, with the particular authority of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in whatever room he entered. He looked at the assembled families. He looked at Hendricks. He looked at William. He looked at Maggie last, and his expression did something brief and revealing the rapid, involuntary assessment of a man who had just identified the person who built the case against him and was recalculating. She held his gaze without difficulty. She had read his documentation for 6 weeks. She knew his methods the way you knew a thing you had studied from every angle. She was not afraid of him. She was the person who had taken everything he thought he had hidden and laid it out in the light. And there was not a great deal he could do to her that was worse than what she had already survived. She testified on the second morning. She was on the stand for 3 hours. Galloway's lead lawyer, a heavy-set man named Ferris, who had the confidence of someone accustomed to dismantling witnesses, came at the accounting documentation from 4 different angles, looking for the gap that wasn't there. He questioned her methodology. She explained it. He questioned her qualifications. She laid them out: 7 years of professional bookkeeping, 11 years of practical account management, beginning at age 14, and the specific documented results of her analysis, which were verifiable by any competent accountant the court wished to appoint. He questioned the chain of custody of the evidence. She walked him through every step of how each document had been handled from the moment she found it to the moment it was submitted to Hendricks. He sat down. The judge, a compact woman in her 50s named Rosenthal, who had listened to the entire proceeding with focused, unreadable attention, looked at the documentation summary for a long moment. Then she looked at Maggie. "Miss Whitmore," she said, "in your professional assessment, was the financial manipulation of Dawson Ranch's accounts consistent with a deliberate strategy to obscure the ranch's true financial position?" "Yes, Your Honor," Maggie said. "It was systematic. It was sustained over 8 months. And it was specifically designed to make the ranch's situation appear worse than it was. In my professional opinion, a person with accounting knowledge which the evidence suggests Pete Holloway possessed would have understood precisely what they were achieving with these alterations. And, in your assessment, could the ranch owner have detected this manipulation without specialized accounting knowledge?" "No," she said. "Not reliably. The manipulation was calibrated to stay below the threshold of casual notice. It required exactly the kind of line-by-line analysis that a ranch operator without accounting training would have no reason to conduct." Judge Rosenthal made a note. She was the kind of judge who made notes that meant something. Samuel Carter testified that afternoon. He was, as Maggie had predicted, not entirely honest. There were things he elided. Moments where his careful phrasing told the shape of a man protecting the edges of his own culpability. But on the central facts that Galloway had personally confirmed the contamination story to him, that Galloway had instructed him to say nothing when the fabrication was revealed, that Galloway had directed Carter to hand-deliver the Morrison deed, he was clear and specific and consistent under cross-examination. Ferris went after him hard. Carter held. Whatever else Samuel Carter was, and Maggie had not revised her understanding of him into something simpler than the truth. He was apparently not a man who could be rattled in a courtroom once he had decided to tell it. She filed that away, without comment, and without forgiveness, and without the particular bitterness that would have made her feel worse, without making anything better. The ruling came on a Friday, 6 days after the hearing concluded. Judge Rosenthal found sufficient evidence to void all 3 property transfers on the grounds of fraudulent inducement. She ordered Western Land and Cattle to return the Harmon, Peterson, and Morrison properties at the original purchase prices, which the families would repay at fair market terms over a period of years. She referred the matter of R.E. Galloway to the state attorney's office for criminal investigation, which Hendricks explained in his accompanying letter meant that whatever Galloway had done in other counties was now formally under scrutiny as well. She also included, in the final paragraph of her ruling, a specific commendation of the accounting documentation submitted by Margaret Whitmore, describing it as exceptionally thorough, clearly organized, and critical to the court's ability to understand the mechanics of the fraud. Hendricks sent a separate note with the ruling. "Frame that paragraph, Miss Whitmore. In 22 years, I have seen 3 such commendations. You've earned this one entirely." The night the ruling arrived, Mrs. Aldridge made a cake. She did not explain why she made a cake, and nobody asked, because the answer was obvious and stating it would have embarrassed everyone. She simply produced it at supper and set it in the middle of the table and sat down with her own plate, which she very rarely did. She usually ate standing at the counter, and they all understood that this was the occasion she had decided it was. Tom ate 2 pieces. Jesse ate 3 and offered a formal toast with his coffee cup that involved, at one point, the phrase "the finest bookkeeper in the state of Texas," at which Maggie said Jesse in the tone that meant he was being excessive. And Jesse said "the finest bookkeeper in this county." "Is that better?" And Tom said no, the first version was accurate, and Mrs. Aldridge, who did not generally contribute to table humor, said "in the state" without looking up from her cake. And that was the end of the discussion. Maggie laughed until her eyes were wet. She had not laughed like that without holding it back. Without the self-conscious monitoring she had practiced, so long it had become automatic in longer than she could remember. And the fact that she had laughed like that at this table, with these people, in this kitchen was itself a thing she wanted to hold carefully and not put down. She opened her accounting service the following week. One morning Tuesday, in the small office above the hardware store that the owner rented cheaply to people with legitimate businesses and good references, both of which she had, she put a card in the window. She told 3 people she trusted, who told 3 people they trusted. And by the second Tuesday she had 4 clients, and by the 4th she had 8. And by the end of November she had a waiting list and a second morning on Thursdays, and Ruth Morrison sitting beside her twice a week, learning the trade with the focused intensity of a young woman discovering a language she had always thought in, but never known how to speak. Dorothy Morrison came by on the second Thursday to thank her. Not for the testimony, not for the ruling, for Ruth. "She's different," Dorothy said. "She walks differently. She looks at people differently. Like she paused, searching for it. Like she's not waiting for someone to tell her what she's worth." "Good," Maggie said simply. Dorothy looked at her. "What happened to you?" "After the station, I landed at the right place," Maggie said. "You landed at a struggling ranch with a man who had no idea his books were wrong, and a thief on the payroll," Dorothy said dryly. "Yes," Maggie said. She meant it completely. Owen Harmon sent a letter from his returned property short, blunt, in the handwriting of a man who used words the way he used tools, for specific purposes and not decoration. It said, 42 years on this land. I thought I was going to die having sold it wrong. Thank you for giving it back to me." He had signed it. And then below the signature, in slightly different ink, as if added after, "My wife says I should have written 2 pages. She's probably right. But those 22 words are true. And I think you know what that's worth." She did know what that was worth. She put the letter in the inside pocket of her coat, where the letters from Samuel Carter had once lived, and she thought it was a reasonable trade. On a Saturday in December, William asked her to walk with him to the far fence of the north pasture. He said he wanted to show her something. She put on her coat and went with him, because she had learned to trust his instincts about what was worth walking to. He stopped at the fence line. She looked out at the pasture. The herd fuller now, healthier, the cattle that had been underweight 4 months ago showing genuine condition, moved through the frost-pale grass with the easy, unhurried confidence of animals whose needs were being met. "I wanted you to see it," he said. "What it looks like now. What it looks like because of everything you did." She looked at the herd. She looked at the fence, which Tom had repaired to something better than its original standard. She looked at the sky, which was very pale, and very clear and very cold. "It looks like yours," she said. "It looks like ours," he said. She turned to look at him. He reached into his coat pocket. He brought out something small, a ring, plain silver. No decoration. The kind of thing a man bought when he understood that the woman he was giving it to valued honesty over ornament. He held it in his palm and looked at her with the expression that was not the careful surface of him, but the thing underneath. the thing that had been moving toward her since a station bench in August. "I am not a man with speeches," he said. "I tried to write one and it was bad. But I know what I mean, and you know what I mean, and I think that's always been enough for us." He held her gaze. "I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs you, though it does. And I'll never pretend otherwise, because you'd know I was lying. But because I need you. Not the accounts. Not the skill. You." He paused. "All of you. The way you press your hands flat on your knees when you're holding something difficult together. The way you read everything twice to make sure. The way you made Ruth Morrison understand what she was worth in 2 hours when nobody had managed it in 20 years. The way you sat across from me at a kitchen table on your first night here and looked at a broken ledger and said someone had to be watching." He closed his fingers around the ring and then opened them again. "Marry me, Maggie." She looked at him. She looked at the ring. She thought briefly, without bitterness, about a station bench, and a letter, and a man who had not come. She thought about $3.40. She thought about the long train ride, and the wagon in the evening light, and the worn ledgers, and Pete Holloway, and Samuel Carter, and Judge Rosenthal, and Ruth Morrison, and a cake produced without explanation, and a letter that said 22 true words. She thought about the woman who had sat on a station bench and told herself, "I am still here, still standing, and that has always been enough before." It had been enough, but this was better than enough. This was the thing that came after surviving, the thing that surviving made room for. If you stayed standing long enough and kept your eyes open and didn't let the wrong closed door convince you that all doors were closed. "Yes," she said. "William." Yes, he put the ring on her finger. She looked at it. He looked at her. And in the north pasture of a ranch that had been saved by a woman who arrived with nothing but her own clear-eyed competence and refused to leave until she had made everything right. Margaret Whitmore, who had once been the woman nobody came for, became, instead, the woman who had built the life she deserved with every skill she had ever taught herself in the dark, and who stood now in the winter light holding the hand of a man who saw all of it and knew without any shadow of remaining doubt that she had not been forgotten by the world. She had simply been waiting for the world to catch up to what she already was.